This month, we're going to take a bit of a sidestep from what we usually do. So we normally we alternate between antimicrobial stewardship and opioid stewardship specific presentations. This month, we want to highlight some of the sort of carry on from how that goes. So normally we'll talk about data and papers and things like that about antimicrobial use or opioid use or various things like that. And a lot of what we found in our group is all of that work tends to carry on to what do you want to do with that data? And a lot of that comes down to creating interventions. So if we find high antimicrobial use somewhere, then we want to go ahead and try and reduce that use, make it more appropriate. So a lot of what we end up doing comes into the world of implementation science. And there's a lot of psychology in implementation science. How do you actually get people, clinicians, to change their behavior, to get the data to look better, essentially, and have more appropriate care for patients. So we've been working in that world, and one of the things that we've wanted to include in our team is someone who has a psychology background to help us get through the very muddy waters of all the different ways that you can work in the world of behavior change and behavior science and stuff like that. So very happy to be able to introduce today Teysa Mize. So she has joined us recently as another data analyst with the team. Teysa has a background in psychology, which has been already a wonderful addition to the team. And so given her expertise, we thought it would be great for her to be able to showcase some of that. So she's going to do a presentation today about self-determination theory and its role in audit and feedback. And so this is really getting to that point of tying in, once you have your data, what can you start to do? How can you get people to change behavior so that you can see the changes that you're looking for? So without further ado, I will stop talking. Just a note that we are being recorded. So again, please ensure to keep your microphones muted, and there should be time for questions at the end. Take it away, Teysa. Take it away, Teysa. There we go.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm just opening up the presentation here with screen sharing. So, all right, that should be open now. Perfect. Whoopsie, I skipped one there. Okay, so I'm Teysa, as Jason mentioned, and my presentation today is on self-determination theory as a framework for audit and feedback in healthcare. So I'll sort of speak about self-determination theory a bit more generally with respect to how it relates to healthcare, and then relate it to a specific process that we use in stewardship and clinical appropriateness, which is audit and feedback. So self-determination theory is a macro theory of human motivation, development, and well-being. So at a really broad level, it's concerned with what motivates people. So those are trait and state levels, and also kind of contextual levels. So at the trait level, we're looking at personality and individual differences, temperament, and individuals' biological predispositions to different motivational orientations. The state level is more activity-specific motivation. So one's motivation towards certain activities or specific domains of their lives. And then social and cultural contextual factors are things in our social and physical environment that are going to influence what we're motivated towards, and also can facilitate our motivation or can hinder it. So one of the reasons why self-determination theory is this huge macro theory is because the findings are really robust. So it's been found that the principles of self-determination theory are applicable cross-culturally in all age groups and in multiple settings. So all the kind of major domains of our lives, such as family, education, the workplace, and importantly for our purposes, healthcare. So within healthcare, self-determination theory has been studied a lot. It's one of the most well-established areas that self-determination theory has been used in. There's been more than 2,600 published experimental intervention studies, and then a ton of descriptive studies as well. And self-determination theory has been used successfully in interventions for a bunch of different health behaviors, such as weight loss, increasing physical activity, increasing compliance with medication directives, helping individuals better self-manage chronic diseases such as diabetes, reducing alcohol consumption, increasing healthy eating, and helping people to quit smoking. So in all of these different areas, the way in which self-determination theory has been used successfully is based on the assumption that individuals have specific motivation towards a specific activity. And it's the quality of that motivation towards a specific activity that will determine one's outcomes in that activity. So to kind of dig into that a little bit more, we'll look at the self-determination continuum. And this is sort of kind of a broad overview of self-determination theory and motivation from this perspective. So we'll kind of spend a bunch of time here and walk through it bit by bit. So as the name would suggest, this is a continuum. So it ranges from non-self-determined to self-determined. So on the left, we have the least self-determined or least autonomous or least volitional type of motivation. And as we get towards the right, motivation towards activities becomes more self-determined, more volitional, and more autonomous. So I'll first kind of go over the two extremes here. So on the left, we have amotivation. So this is complete non-regulatory, non-regulation of behaviors. So this can be because somebody in a certain area, it's just so outside of their area of competency or so outside of their wheelhouse that there's just no motivation towards that activity. Or it can just be a complete lack of intentionality. So they just simply don't care. But either way, this is sort of our black hole of motivation. In contrast to that, on the right, we have intrinsic motivation. So this is like the gold standard of motivation. These, excuse me. So these are the things that individuals do for no reason besides the activity itself. So these are sort of things like our hobbies. When we don't have to do something, there's no reason to do it, but that's what we choose to do because there's some sort of inherent joy or satisfaction that we get from engaging in the activity itself. Those are the things that are intrinsically motivated for us. But the vast majority of our behaviors fall here within extrinsic motivation. And you'll notice that extrinsic motivation has a bunch of different regulatory styles. And it really kind of spans the continuum. So on the left, external regulation is, far down towards the non-self-determined side, whereas on the right there, integrated regulation is going a lot more towards the self-determined side. So extrinsic motivation really kind of spans the continuum, and that's where most of our motivation is going to lie. So we'll kind of go through these step by step to sort of give more context to why it's important to understand our motivation towards our activities. So one common context that we all have here is healthcare. And within healthcare, one thing that we know is that there's a lot of time and resources that go towards treating preventable diseases or problems that individuals get themselves into because they're not taking care of themselves. And it's no secret, this is something that we all know, that one of the best things we can do to take care of ourselves and to have a good quality of life and to sort of give ourselves the best chance of staying as healthy as possible throughout our lifespan is eating right and exercising. But that's something that so many of us fail to do, even though we know that it's so important. And the reason why people do this at varying levels in terms of their engagement in things like diet, exercise, and other health behaviors is because they have different regulatory styles or different motivations towards those activities. So we can kind of walk through these one by one, sort of using that as an example. So with respect to external regulation, this is when reasoning for behaviors is completely outside of the self. So it can be there's some sort of external source or force that is making someone do something, or they're complying with it. A lot of the time, too, this revolves around external rewards or punishments. So when there's a reward for doing a behavior or a punishment for not doing a behavior. So with respect to health behaviors, we can think of this as, say, contestants on the TV show The Biggest Loser. So these are people who had typically lived a non-healthy lifestyle, and all of a sudden their behaviors changed very rapidly, where they started eating extremely healthy and exercising a lot. So it's sort of a complete 180. There was a lot of motivation there to make some really quick changes. But what we know is there's a lot of external rewards involved in a situation like that. So the idea of fame, recognition, validation, and most importantly, a cash prize. So people are motivated because of those external rewards that are there. Interjected regulation still involves rewards and punishments, but they're more internal rewards and punishments. And there's a lot of social comparison and ideas of how people view they're going to be judged and how they think that's going to make them feel. So this is sort of a mix of internal and external, but the internal part is our internal evaluation of what the external valuation of our behavior will be. So it's a little complicated there, but I'll give an example with this one too. So this might be somebody who decides that they're going to eat healthier and exercise because they have a friend group. And everyone in their friend group is, into being healthy, and they don't like being the only person when they go out to eat, the only one that orders dessert. They don't like when they go hiking with their friends to be the one that's lagging behind. This makes them feel a sense of guilt or shame, and they feel judged by people. Whether that's real or imagined, whether or not they're actually being judged, they're internally feeling that based on what the external world is telling them. This could also be with respect to social comparison ideas. This could also be someone that decides to lose weight because they think this is going to make them more attractive to others. So next, identified regulation. And notice here we're starting to get onto the self-determined side of the continuum. So with identified regulation, now it's getting more internal. So this is where people see an importance or value in the activity itself. So this might be somebody who decides to eat healthy and exercise because they want to live a long, healthy life. And they know that this is one of the things that they can do that's within their control, that they can do to help improve their chances of having a better quality of life as they get older. So it's not that they love eating salad all the time. It's not that they love cardio, but they understand that these are the means to the end to get them where they want to go. And because they value their health, they value these activities that are going to get them there. And lastly, we have integrated regulation. So this is when something has become completely internalized. So not only do individuals feel that the activity itself is important and it's valuable, but they've really synthesized it with themselves. So it has become part of their identity. So we can think about this. We all know those people who living a healthy lifestyle is part of who they are. It's part of their identity. These are the people who are making smoothies, doing meal prep every day at the gym, 5 a.m., no excuses. Those people have integrated regulation. This has really been intertwined with their value system, how they view themselves, what their identity is. It's become integrated with themselves, and they fully internalize that behavior. So the one thing is, even though we've gone through these 4 different regulatory styles, so it's clear that they can all have very different reasons for why they're doing behavior, but they're all doing the same behavior. So when I went through all these, we could see that everybody, well, the 4 groups I talked about, there were different reasons for why they were doing things, but we were ending up at the same place. They were all living a healthy lifestyle. We all were getting there. So why do we care that some of these people are doing these things for a cash prize, and some of these people are doing these things because of their friends, and some of these people are doing these things because they've integrated it with their identity? So the reason why that's important is because as behavior becomes more internalized, it becomes more stable over time. So if we think about the externally regulated folks and contestants on The Biggest Loser, research has shown that the vast majority of them are going to gain some, if not all, of the weight back. Once the external reward is gone, so too is their motivation. Whereas if we think about our integrated regulation people, these people where living a healthy lifestyle is part of who they are, this is usually a continuous behavior over the lifespan. Individuals don't usually wake up one day and completely drop this because it's part of who they are. So this is important to note in terms of a healthcare setting, because our goal is not for people to have healthy behaviors for a few weeks or a few months. You know, anytime people are being healthier, that's great, but ideally we want people to do that throughout the lifespan. We don't want it to be a short-term thing. So looking at it from that perspective, it's very important that people internalize behaviors and develop an integrated regulatory style towards them, because we're likely to have a lot more stability in terms of behavior, and it's likely to be long-term. So luckily, this is a continuum, which means people are not stuck in one of these categories. They can move along this continuum, both forwards and backwards. Of course, we always hope that they're moving forwards towards internalization. And there are things that can help that process. So sometimes people move towards integrated regulation just sort of as a natural process, but other times they don't. And so it's up to the people around them who are trying to promote healthy behaviors to help facilitate that. And research indicates that one way we can facilitate that is through basic psychological needs satisfaction. So basic psychological needs are thought to be fundamental building blocks that are needed in order for individuals to experience growth and integration. So these basic psychological needs are autonomy. So this is the degree to which an individual feels a sense of volition and control over their actions, plans, and environment. Competence, the degree to which an individual feels they can effectively meet challenges, complete tasks, and achieve goals. And relatedness, so the degree to which an individual feels a sense of belonging, connection, value, and respect with others. So these are sort of like necessary conditions that must be met in order for behavior to be internalized or stabilized. So if these 3 things are not present, individuals are unlikely to move along the continuum towards internalization. And another reason why these are so important is because even if a person has already shifted down that continuum towards more integrated regulatory styles, these are still necessary conditions which must be met for that behavior to continue being stable. So not only does it help stabilize behavior, but it makes behavior sustainable over time as well. So to kind of put together all of that stuff, this is the self-determination theory behavior change process model that's used in intervention studies in healthcare utilizing a self-determination theory perspective. So essentially, the studies are utilizing an intervention that is aimed at supporting individuals' basic psychological needs. This this basic psychological need satisfaction then helps move people down that behavioral regulation continuum towards internalization and ultimately results in more positive health behaviors, depending on what the target behavior of the intervention was. And one interesting thing is, because these are basic psychological needs, they also have a positive effect on our psychological well-being. And this almost sort of creates an interactive effect where when individuals are in a better mindset and experiencing more healthy psychological functioning, they're also more easily able to regulate their behavior better. So interventions of this sort of are doubly beneficial in that we get benefits towards physical health with the target behavior of the intervention, and also more positive mental health. So this is the process model with respect to interventions in healthcare more generally. But within our Department of Stewardship and Clinical Appropriateness, we are using sort of some different processes, and our target population isn't necessarily patients or the general public. A lot of the time, our target population can be other healthcare professionals, so physicians. So if we were to take this process model and alter it for our purposes in stewardship and clinical appropriateness, it would look like this. So our intervention would be audit and feedback using basic psychological needs satisfaction support strategies. This would result in basic psychological needs satisfaction, helping people to internalize behavior and move along the self-determination continuum, and ultimately result in positive behavior change. And the target behaviors in this context would be adherence to clinical guidelines, benchmarks, and best practices. So to sort of set this causal chain in motion, our goal would be incorporating basic psychological needs support strategies within audit and feedback. And as Jason kind of mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, it's sort of the bridging of two worlds. Implementation science and audit and feedback isn't traditionally associated with self-determination theory and basic psychological needs satisfaction. So it's important for us to consider whether or not it makes sense to do this and whether or not this would be a viable strategy. So with respect to self-determination theory and its relevance to implementation science, so there's a ton of conceptual overlap. Although there aren't a ton of papers that are explicitly mirroring these two topics, the conceptual overlap is like remarkable. So a lot of the strategies that are talked about in the implementation science papers, like giving feedback, using things as a learning opportunity versus a blaming exercise. These are principles of self-determination theory. And one thing I found in the reading that I've done with implementation science is a lot of these things are explained as strategies that work, but it's not explained why they work. So the sort of causal mechanism that makes these things successful within audit and feedback isn't really explained. And so my inclination is to believe that that has to do with the motivational underpinnings that it's associated with. So beyond the conceptual overlap, there are a few papers that do explicitly bring these things together. So one of the papers went as far as saying that the entire stages of change model should be altered to include low and high intrinsic motivation as barriers, enablers, respectively, because they found that these were two of their biggest predictors in the success of their audit and feedback process. And I think more studies would have findings like this if they were testing for it, because you're not going to find significant results with something you don't measure. So I do think that there's, reasonable evidence there that self-determination theory does have a place within implementation science. if we broaden our scope a little bit and consider clinical policy, self-determination theory has been talked about a lot with respect to clinical policy. So I'll give one example of that because I like how this sort of nicely ties it all together. Self-determination theory, a widely researched and empirically validated theory of human need fulfillment and motivation, offers a potentially valuable theoretical framework for understanding not only why the current policy environment has not led to the anticipated improvement in quality and safety of clinical care, but importantly also provides guidance about how organizations can create an environment that can nurture behavioral change in their workforce. So the other part of this that I mentioned a couple slides ago is that within audit and feedback, the target population is physicians. And this is sort of a unique group of people. So it's also important to consider if the principles of self-determination theory are relevant to physicians. And indeed, just as with the general public, greater autonomy, competence, and relatedness is associated with greater job engagement, greater job satisfaction, less exhaustion, and less burnout amongst both Canadian medical students and practicing Canadian physicians. So if we go back to this proposed behavior change model here, given that self-determination theory seems to be related with some direct evidence, but also, peripherally as well, it does seem to indicate that audit and feedback using basic psychological need satisfaction support strategies would likely lead to some success with behavior changes ultimately. So largely the question then is, how do we actually do this? So I sort of compiled a list of strategies that have been used successfully before in different behavioral interventions in healthcare. So I know that there's a bunch there on the screen, so I'll just maybe pause for a few seconds so everyone can read those over a little bit. Okay, so one thing it's important to note here is that this is a list compiled from things done in a bunch of different studies. So these are almost sort of different options for strategies. This isn't a checklist. So if you're thinking, okay, this looks like a lot, all of these things are not meant to be done every time. And it isn't really a checklist that can be necessarily gone through. There's some intuitive reasoning that is needed here because this is more sort of a guiding style of interpersonal communication to be used. And the way one goes about this with respect to supporting one's autonomy, competence, and relatedness will depend on a few things. So it's going to depend on your target audience. It's going to depend on how much time you have. The structure of your intervention. It's going to depend on your target behavior and what you're expecting from people. So those things are all sort of dependent, the strategies that one uses are going to be dependent on those factors. So one can kind of cherry pick what will work best based on their target audience, the structure of their session, and what they're hoping to accomplish with it. So as long as there's sort of some element of each one of these, so some form of support for one's autonomy, competence, and relatedness, you're likely to get more positive behavior change results. And this is particularly important for something like audit and feedback, where I would expect a lot of people would have external regulation towards. Remember when we talked about that and about how external regulation comes from some sort of external source, essentially telling someone what to do. And now that's not the main goal of audit and feedback. It's supposed to be, a bit more gentler than that, but that's how it can sometimes feel to people. It can feel like something that isn't necessarily super comfortable or a super nice process, because it is essentially an external department looking and saying, here's what you're doing, here's what you should be doing. And that can feel, feel difficult for people. So if we want that to go a bit more successfully and to increase the likelihood that that people will incorporate positive behavior changes, that's more in line with benchmarks, guidelines for best practice, then we can incorporate some of this. So ultimately, by creating a social climate of relatedness, fostering a sense of competence, and providing an autonomy supportive environment, we can facilitate the internalization of behaviors that are originating from an inherently external process. And the end result here will be increased motivation towards positive behavior changes that are going to help stabilize behavior and make that behavior sustainable over time, ultimately resulting in more long-term positive behavior change. And so that's the end. So thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you, Desiree. That was a wonderful presentation. I just want to open it up. Are there any burning questions that anyone has? I'll pause here for a few seconds and let anyone, you can either type them in, or even better yet, you can unmute yourself and ask any questions that you have. I really don't have any questions, because obviously we've talked about this a lot, but I just want to really highlight some points that you've made that I think, to me, when we connect with these clinicians, are important. And so we've found ourselves time and again sort of walking this line of behavior change, right? So how do we get the data, we see where there's a potential, where there's a problem or a potential, some room for potential improvement. And then we have to find out, okay, now how do we, for all intents and purposes, manipulate people's behavior to get them to do what we want them to do, right? And it sounds kind of conniving. It sounds kind of, there's a lot of marketing, there's a lot of psychology involved in this, but there's science too, and that's kind of the cool piece of this. So I just want to highlight. So okay, I see Lisa Phillips is logged in here, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's pharmacy related, right? So you work with Vikash, right, up near Kindersley, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah, I'm based in Rosetown, but yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, here's a perfect example of where we've kind of come across this. So Vikash is one of the pharmacists who works in Kindersley and surrounding area, and he's been very involved in antimicrobial stewardship as well as Lisa and other collaborators in their team. And so we had an opportunity to work with them last spring and kind of look at some of the stuff. They've been very diligent about collecting data, and so that's often one of the first problems that we hit is, what do I even do to do antimicrobial stewardship, as an example? Okay, I'm collecting this data. How do I collect data? What should I collect? Those kinds of things. So they kind of crossed those barriers, and they had a bunch of data. And then it came down to that next question of, okay, well, what do we do? So, okay, well, we'll go through the data analysis. We'll crunch the numbers. We'll try and look for areas where there might be room for improvement. And then this is where people always hit that wall of like, okay, now how do I get people to do this? I mean, you show this data to a room full of physicians, and you can often get a very cold reception. A lot of the things that Desiree spoke about. And so this is where, we need to make use of some of these, really that psychology side of implementation science. How do you get people to engage? How do you get the behavior change to be taken up and to be incorporated into their practice? And sometimes we're limited in our ability to do that kind of stuff. So it makes for this really interesting world and an area where there's a lot of opportunity for learning, both within our group and I think across the province, about what are some of the best ways to do this kind of stuff. And we can easily look to the literature. There's a lot of great information in the literature. And then a lot of it just comes down to some trial and error in your local areas. One of the things that we always try to do is ensure that we are working with people who are engaging us in the first place. So we try not to walk into an area and be like, hey, here's some data that shows how crappy you are at your job. You want to do something better? That tends to not work. But when we have clinicians who come to us and say, hey, I think this is an issue, how can we do better? So the emergency department has done this with us, looking at the use of tests, laboratory tests. Pediatrics has done this. They want to look at antimicrobial use and things like that, and various places like that. And we find you often have better luck getting going with those people. And I think a lot of it speaks to that intrinsic motivation that Tesserae was speaking about at the beginning, right? You have people who are just, for whatever reasons, are more inclined to want to make that change, to provide better care and things like that. So anyways, I picked on you, Lisa, just because I wanted to know, really, from your perspective, are these types of talks something that would be interesting to clinical folk in terms of, hey, here's something you can think about when you're trying to implement the changes now that you've gotten your data, looked at your data for people who are already that far?
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. I mean, because like you said, the traditional way of going to them with the information is not very successful. And so it's good to have some alternative ways of thinking about it and ways to present it so that it's received in the manner in which it's intended, so that they can actually find their own internal motivation to have an actual practice change, because that's where we've been struggling, right? We have a ton of data. We have some hot spots that we think are areas that we should be clinically focusing on, but the buy-in and the difficulty in communicating that is really where you hit the wall, and then you get frustrated and not motivated to try and move further. Yeah. Yes, I think this kind of information is really, really helpful.
Okay, great. That's good to know. Thank you, Lisa. That's, yeah, I think that's one of the things that us as a program, as far as stewardship and clinical appropriateness, or as our department, we're trying to figure out how we can help support this across the province. And so obviously, you know, we've had, as we've talked about, lots of requests for just help, just how do I even, what data should I collect? How do I analyze that? How do I present that? But I think the next step for those people who are there is to really start talking about this implementation piece. How do you actually try and get those changes? So this might be something where we try and incorporate more of these types of talks. And even I think carrying on when we talk about some of our work, not just highlighting we collected this data, we found this problem, but then what did we do about it for some of our projects who are getting to that point. I just see that Colleen has sent a question here too. How do you measure success objectively? So Tesserae, did you want to?
With self-determination theory, behavior change, intervention studies, it sort of depends on exactly what behavior it is. So for studies that have, looked at this previously and assessed, they look at things like weight loss. So whether or not people lost weight, and did people who were in a basic psychological needs satisfaction group lose more than individuals in a control group. If you're looking at quitting smoking, you could look at, days to quit smoking, or who reduced their smoking more. If we were looking at this within audit and feedback, we would look at essentially something like prescribing habits. If it's something that is looking at, okay, well, these things are, being prescribed in a certain way. So looking at whether there is any measurable reduction in that. And in terms of measuring whether or not individuals are experiencing basic psychological needs satisfaction, so is this the actual mechanism causing this? So there's several different ways to measure intrinsic motivation or basic psychological needs satisfaction. If you wanted to look at it at a general level, so Jason mentioned, looking for individuals who already have intrinsic motivation towards something. So that would be using general causality orientation theory, where they look at individuals' biological predispositions to different motivational styles. And those people who have autonomous as opposed to controlled motivation will generally sort of find their way across the across the regulatory style continuum towards internalization. If you're looking at it at more of a sort of state level, for example, when I was talking about how physicians who have greater autonomy, competence, and relatedness satisfaction. So there's measures that look at within the workplace individuals' basic psychological need satisfaction with self-report measures. So looking at that before and after an intervention aiming to increase basic psychological need satisfaction would allow a measure for that. You can also look at goal content theory. So that's looking at, so essentially in something like audit and feedback, if we wanted to measure that, we could also utilize measures of, and these are more qualitative measures because these are looking at whether one's goals or intentions towards their activities are intrinsic or extrinsic in nature. And then the ratio of that is used to calculate whether they have more intrinsic or extrinsic motivation towards a given behavior. So there's a lot of ways to that one could, you know, quantitatively assess and measure this. It would just sort of depend on the goals, essentially, of exactly where someone is using this and what they were kind of hoping to accomplish.
With that, thank you, Tessa Ray, for a wonderful presentation. Thank you to everyone who joined us today.